Hi everyone, good Tuesday afternoon and welcome to Go Local Live. I'm Go Local News editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for tuning in for some national news and politics with Professor Jennifer Lawless down at the University of Virginia. Jennifer, thank you for joining us today.
I'm happy to join you.
Well, past Labor Day, school is clearly back in session now, and very excited to pick your brain with some recent politics around the country. I don't know if there was a publication you weren't quoted in this week. And especially in the realm of women in politics, the decision by Kirsten Gillibrand to withdraw from the race and more, this sort of continued fixation on the role of female candidates. Let's talk a little bit as what the comments you made pertaining to Kirsten Gillibrand's, basically her platform and how it was very difficult in a crowded field.
Yeah, I think that there's this tendency to assume that when a woman is dropping out of the presidential race, it has something to do with the fact that she's a woman. And we have 24 candidates running. In the past week, we've not only seen Kirsten Gillibrand drop out, we saw Jay Inslee, we saw John Hickenlooper. This is not a situation where qualified candidates are staying in and everybody else is getting out. It's that even qualified candidates, like sitting senators, who have no path to the nomination, are beginning to realize that. And in Kirsten Gillibrand's case, what was particularly difficult for her, I think, was the fact that she was running on this profile that had to do mostly with women and women's issues, or issues that we traditionally think about as women's issues or feminist issues. And it was a challenge this election cycle because most of the candidates in the Democratic primary are seen as very credible on those issues and prioritize those issues as well. So it wasn't a matter of choosing those priorities versus somebody else. It was that almost all of the candidates would allow you to check that box if issues pertaining to women, families, and children were important to you.
And this continued question of can a woman be elected president? I know in years past it was the year, it will be the year of the woman when it stopped being described as the year of the woman. Why does this continue to persist to be an issue?
Well, we've still never had a female president of the United States. So that's the one glass ceiling that remains to be fully shattered. I would remind everybody who sort of have this knee-jerk reaction that we're not ready to elect a woman, though, that Hillary Clinton did receive 3 million more votes than Donald Trump. So that's not to suggest that the Electoral College vote should be thrown out. It's just to suggest that when it comes to public opinion and the nation in its entirety, we're certainly willing to elect a woman, and I don't think that 2020 is going to be any different.
So on the campaign trails, so to speak, former Vice President Joe Biden had another slip up this week, the recollection of pinning a medal on a war hero. He's had a number of gaffes in the last couple of months. It seemed to coalesce this week with his needing to respond to seemingly piecing together a number of different instances that weren't actually the event as it occurred. What's your reaction both to his comments and the reaction from the press pertaining to it?
Well, to just set the stage for a minute, this is a situation where he told a story where the entire story basically represented the truth, but no component part of it was true or actually happened. So the time was wrong, the person was wrong, the circumstances were wrong, but the general sentiment of the story was correct. And I think it's telling us a few things. The first is that everybody, the media, the voters, the other candidates on the stage, are looking for a narrative that can allow them to cast Joe Biden as too old, as sort of losing his touch, as not remembering everything. And whether that's sort of, blatant claims of senility or just highlighting to voters that he can't get his story straight, it's meant to represent, I think, more than just a gaffe. It's not just misspeaking. It's supposed to tap into, or the way that it's being covered anyway, is supposed to tap into this broader issue and concern as to whether Joe Biden is too old. My general sense is that voters don't care. Voters want to beat Donald Trump, and whether there's reason to believe it or not, the perception out there is that Joe Biden is still the best person to beat Donald Trump. And what this actually does, I think, is lower the bar even more for Joe Biden's next debate performance, where if he's able to get through relatively gaffe-free, he'll once again exceed expectations and probably maintain the lead that he has in the polls.
And let's talk a little bit about gaffes, if you will, because Joe Biden's oftentimes get called gaffes, not outright lies. Oftentimes, President Donald Trump's statements are asserted in certain instances as outright lies. But this past week, when he was talking about hurricanes hitting the United States, said he'd never heard of a hurricane, Category 5 hurricane hitting the States, when in fact it had. Let's bring that into context a little bit. Of course, folks had pointed out that Category 5 hurricanes had in fact hit under his presidency. Slip up or outright lie?
Both. And by both, I mean that Donald Trump demonstrates a complete lack of compassion and empathy. So the fact that he's actually even said before, and CNN played footage, back to back of him saying, I've never heard of a Category 5 storm. This isn't the first time he's even made that statement. Demonstrates that he just doesn't care that much. He isn't hit by the Category 5 storm. He isn't threatened by the Category 5 storm. And he doesn't think that U.S. citizens, whether they live in Puerto Rico or somewhere else, who are going to be potentially faced with that kind of death and devastation and destruction, are that important to him. So the lack of remembering, I don't think, is necessarily an explicit lie, but it speaks to, in some ways, an even broader problem, which is the lack of concern for the American people. The reason that I do think that there's a little bit of a lie involved is because the way that he gets out of these misstatements is to lie, is to say, well, this has actually never happened before, and facts don't matter to him. So it becomes this sort of weird web that he weaves where, in an attempt to sort of make it like he's not lying, he winds up doubling down on the lies.
And so, of course, all eyes are on Florida and southern parts of the United States, seeing what happens with Hurricane Dorian hitting. Clearly, we will have to see, with all prayers that the South does get spared. The reaction is always a political event.
It is. And, I think this time around, what we're seeing is actual discussion about the extent to which the federal government can be expected to kick in. And we see Donald Trump doubling down on comments he made regarding the hurricane in Puerto Rico 2 years ago. And I think that's pretty new. Up until the Trump presidency, there had always been this general sense that Democrats and Republicans come together in the face of a national disaster or an emergency. In fact, it hurt Chris Christie in 2012, and it ultimately hurt Mitt Romney and that whole ticket in 2012, because Chris Christie, as a Republican governor of New Jersey, actually had the audacity to hug Barack Obama when he came to the Jersey Shore a few weeks before the election in the face of a devastating hurricane. And so, the politics of it played out where Republicans didn't like that Christie and thus Romney might have been a little bit too comfy. But it did demonstrate that, governors and the president work together, because at the end of the day, it's about making sure that the American people have what they need to survive a storm like this. And I feel like that is now thrown out the window, and that's not the kind of discussion that we're seeing anymore.
We'll see what happens with the storm and its aftermath. Speaking of President Trump, former staffer Corey Lewandowski eyeing a Senate run in New Hampshire.
Let him. I think that if there is any state that is becoming decreasingly red and bluer and bluer and bluer, it's New Hampshire. And New Hampshire is the live free or die state. It's not Trump town. It's not Trump territory. The Republicans that get elected there tend not to be of the conservative brand that Trump is touting. So I don't think that that's the best place for Corey Lewandowski to launch a political career if, in fact, elected office is in his future.
The strategy, if any, behind it, looking to be perhaps a referendum on the president.
Yeah, that could be what's going on. It's also there's the possibility that this is a way to really motivate and energize Trump's base in a place where, you don't have that many people. You could wind up actually if you can affect voter turnout to such an extent of people who might not be inclined to turn out, then that might be enough to swing an election. But with a candidate like that, you can bet that the Democrats are going to basically replace Corey Lewandowski's face with Donald Trump's. And I think that in those races, Donald Trump loses.
Speaking of races as well, former West Virginia Governor Joe Manchin, now in the Senate, making the announcement not looking to get back into the governor's office anytime soon. Out of the confines of West Virginia, what does this say about national politics?
Well, I think a few things. The first is that Joe Manchin realizes that he's basically well positioned to become the most important senator in the United States. If the Democrats pick up a couple of seats, he could be pivotal on virtually every single vote. And he knows that. He says that he thinks being governor is the best job there is out there, but I think he also realizes that he would be incredibly vilified. There's virtually no chance that the Democrats would be able to hold on to Joe Manchin's Senate seat. So it wouldn't only be that he'd be running for governor, it would be that he'd be making it far more difficult for the Democrats to either hold where they are or pick up a Senate seat. But, I think he looked around and he realized he's got a shot at doing something better and having more power than probably any other senator in the chamber.
So here we are, start of September. What are we keeping an eye on in the coming week?
Well, the next debate, obviously, is really important. Only 10 candidates qualified, which means that it's going to be one debate stage again. But I would expect over the course of the next week to see these campaigns begin to differentiate themselves from one another a little bit more. Warren and Sanders may be differentiating themselves a little bit, and Warren and Biden becoming the real two options that Democratic voters have. So I think that that's what we're going to be looking at in terms of the election. And the storm and Donald Trump's response to the storm will obviously be relevant all the way through the end of the week. We're talking about the storm not hitting the Carolinas or even northern Florida until Thursday or Friday.
And let's talk about that 10-person debate stage. We've talked about this before with previous debates, and you say campaigns really looking to differentiate themselves. But again, 10 candidates on the stage looking for any piece of oxygen. Is this the best and highest ideal format for voters as they're trying to suss out candidates?
No. In a lot of ways, it's the best for the candidates that don't really want to speak that much. So if Joe Biden, for example, is still trying to shore up his, in practice and make sure that he's ready to go, this is the best news that he could possibly have received. But in a lot of ways, I was hoping that an 11th candidate would qualify because we would wind up having two debates where you would have 6 against 5. And although you want them all talking to each other, a group of 6 or a group of 5 at least allows for some conversation where we've seen that these groups of 10 don't. Now, the good news, of course, is that the same way that we've seen a winnowing after each of the debates, it's likely that we'll see another winnowing after this one because the qualifications to get into the next one remain even higher. So we'll get there eventually, and we'll probably go into Iowa and New Hampshire with a 5 or 6 person field, at which point we can really start having these discussions. But it's unlikely that those 5 or 6 people are going to be any different than the 5 or 6 that we would have expected a year ago.
And finally, before we let you go, how do you expect Warren and Sanders to really try to pull apart? And let's talk specifically with Senator Warren, as she's seen some numbers surging in latest polls. What do you expect to see from talking points from her in this next debate?
I really think that for her, the next debate is going to hinge on the fact that she needs to make the case that very progressive policies that have seemed like they're sort of too difficult to implement or too much of a challenge are just as doable in this political environment as these more moderate policies that voters perceive Joe Biden putting forward. And in fact, polarization helps her make her case. It doesn't matter what you're putting out there. Republicans and Democrats don't work together anymore. So, I think you can make a pretty compelling case that if you're not going to get Republicans on board ever, you may as well push a little bit to the left. I think Joe Biden will argue that even during times of heightened polarization, he has been able to bring a Republican or 2 on board, and that's good for the country. At the end of the day, I think those are really the big differences. Sure, they have different views of healthcare. Sure, they have different views about for whom college will be entirely free as opposed to partially subsidized. But again, even their very, very different visions are far more like one another's than they are the Republican parties.
Well, again, all eyes on 2020. And as always, we appreciate your taking the time to Skype into us from UVA. Thank you, Professor Lawless.
Of course.
Okay, and thank you for watching today. If you caught us earlier, we were live on the scene of the Teamsters informational picket outside the Providence Journal. You can read more about that on GoLocal or catch previous coverage on Facebook as well. We look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow on GoLocal Live with more. But of course, throughout the evening, find us on Facebook, find us on GoLocalProv.com, and we'll see you tomorrow. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel.